While typically hailed as a moving tale of how love conquers all, Romeo and Juliet, perhaps Shakespeare's most famous play, may be a very different story than you remember. Romeo's impulsive love for Juliet comes only a day after he was madly in love with someone else, something the friar is sure to remind him before he marries the two. After marrying her, Romeo only continues to make more foolish mistakes, including murdering not one, but two men in cold blood. He is continually tortured over the fact that he cannot be with his love that he has only met days prior, and forces an apothecary to sell him deadly poison, a capital offense, by the way, so that he may kill himself because he believes that she is dead. The story of love conquering all ends with the death of both protagonists, as well as three others. And while the most obvious theme in the final scene has to do with the pointless feud between the two great families of Verona, one cannot help but wonder if Shakespeare was offering a critique, not a commendation, of such obsessive and foolish love. While love is a good thing, and he who finds a wife finds a good thing, Romeo's obsession over Juliet proved his undoing. Augustine, too, finds this to be the case in his life. He loves many things that are good things, but finds that he allows this love to overtake him. His love for his concubine, love for his friend, and love even for a well known orator of the time turns into obsession. He allows them to become all encompassing, so much so that upon the death of his friend, he is almost entirely broken. The older Augustine, writing the story, looks back, regretfully, for how the loves of his heart at the time took him to and fro over the waves of this life, causing him to wander like a ship in the night, with no harbor to come safely home to. All of these loves in his life caused him to drift away, not toward the great I am, who is love. So, how are the good things that steal our affections in this world really good, then? If they are good, they are indeed worthy of affection. Otherwise, they would be an evil, not a good. But they continually serve to rob Augustine of the rest his soul longed for. For too many in our world today, they serve that same end. The pleasures of food, drink, sex, wealth, comfort, entertainment, etc., keep people from devoting themselves to the worship of God, the creator of all these things, who even called these things good. Does God not realize that in giving us these things, we are pulled away from him? How then can they be good? What are they for? Today, we'll examine how Augustine begins to answer this question. For if we are to live in this world that God called very good, we Christians must indeed have an answer to such a question. The Texan Reformers equips men to fight for their Lord and King Jesus Christ, applying all of his word to all of life. And indeed, we are live again. Welcome, gentlemen. We are back talking about Augustine, continuing on his life and his journey toward Christ, but he is, of course, not there. He's not really even close. Today, we really see how he begins to solidify in his position in Manichaeanism and to be pulled further away from Christ. But of course, we know that this is just the beginning of the story, and we are getting to him finally finding that rest his soul longs for. But gentlemen, how are y'all today? It is good to be with you.
Very
Doing
good.
fantastic.
Nice
Good.
cold open, Maltby. I like it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And it's good to be back in the saddle. Before we jump into the different questions that I have prepared for us today, I'll start with you, Reverend Miller. What were your initial thoughts in jumping into this chapter?
Yeah, I think a lot of what um, I saw in Augustine in this chapter, as you mentioned briefly in the cold open, was um, his love for others and his not only obsession but just kind of the way that pride was working in his heart to um, keep him focused on his own self-interests and own desires and these different relationships that we're going to talk about, and to keep him pulled away and apart from God. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, it really kind of the deadly barbs of sin is what He reminds me too of what Solomon speaks of in Ecclesiastes, where he went on this vain search for pleasure apart from God and for value apart from God, and Augustine also speaks a lot about vanity. So it's I see a lot of connections there.
Mm-hmm.
Indeed. Mr. O'Brien.
Reverend Miller. No. Reverend Maltby. Reverend Squared. No, as I say before, I have a weird schedule. So whenever I do this podcast, I've woken up 30 minutes ago. So give me time. I'm drinking my coffee. No, it's good. Reminds me just of, he's a young man. He's not a young man like we have young men today, because the young men we have today are far less thoughtful. And again, he's basically in his master's degree equivalent, if not a PhD level thinking, that equivalent of what we would have today. But you see the passions of a younger man. It's just a continuation. It's almost non-unique to some of these other chapters. It's just a different flavor. It's another thing. Like Carl had already said, it's just the next thing on his list, where you see the theme that we see in his opening book, that our hearts are restless until we find rest in you, right? So he's checking all the boxes of where can I find rest, right? In the opening, he talks about how he was pursuing empty glory of popularity, ambition for applause, the audience of the theater, garlands of grass, concerned with the follies of public entertainment and unrestrained lusts. And so, entertainment, you see the bread and circuses that we have today. Now we have the same lusts, the same demons, and the same gods of just mindless entertainment and folly. Things don't change much because we're all human. So this is why it's good to read old dead guys. This is a very old, very dead man. But it
He is
reminds
alive.
you, yeah,
in Christ.
So yes, takes you out of modernism a little bit, but also reminds you it's like nothing that we experience is uncommon to man. So it brings you out of your modern times, but then it also gives you a bit of a reminder of, this is nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. So it's a little encouraging too to see we wrestle with the same things and see the takes that he has. But all interesting stuff. Excited to get into
Very
it.
true. Yeah. And I've brought it up on past podcasts before, but it's something I like to bring up, is that he lives in the Roman Empire, which is not so different from the world in which we live. He's living in the 4th century, so it's definitely at the.
Are you calling America an empire?
What? That's a topic for another podcast. But indeed, yes, America is an empire.
What?
and so there are many similarities you can pick up on here, right? As this is when Rome's on its downslope. If its height was kind of the 2nd century, or maybe the 3rd century, we're now in the 4th and getting into the 5th, and it's starting to really have its downward fall. Actually, one of the bigger moments leading up to his fall, Augustine writes about in his perhaps more famous work and much longer work, The City of God. And so we are seeing, this bread and circuses idea, right, which is a phrase coined by the Romans, that in order to continue to have power or to maintain order in the Senate and the emperor in his office, the most important thing was to provide bread and circuses to the people of the empire. The more malicious politicians would say, give them bread and circuses and you can get away with anything. And so we see him indulging in many of these bread and circuses, and this taking him far afield from where he knows he should be as the author looking back on his life at this point. And he mentions very early that he finally meets a woman that he wants to settle down with, for lack of a better term, He's not just pursuing one woman after another like he has been. But even so, even though he is now attached to one woman, does he marry her?
No,
No.
he has a compact of lustful love,
Yes.
is what he calls it. Yeah, and he does make some distinction between that kind of compact and marriage, but really the marriage bond, he calls it the restraint of the marriage bond that's contracted with the view of having children. Right, so he had an understanding that marriage is good for and right. Procreation should be happening in marriage, but he calls this other relationship a compact and lust, which really, in a lot of ways, that connects and is consistent with in the previous chapters and books about, he views these inordinate desires and sinful desires to be lustful.
Because he essentially, looking back, he does look at the ontology of marriage a little bit, which is he mentions children in both, and he does have a child with this woman later on. Never marries her, which he regrets. Eventually parts ways with her. I think he should have married her. But he said, nevertheless, she was the only girl for me, and I was faithful to her. Like, okay, it's halfway there, but also not there at all. With her, I learned by direct experience how wide a difference there is between the partnership of marriage entered into for the sake of having a family and the mutual consent of those whose love is a matter of physical sex and for whom the birth of a child is contrary to their intentions, even though, if offspring arrive, they compel their parents to love them. So you can't ever really escape nature, in a sense, where he's saying, if children come even outside of marriage, there's still this natural aspect where you still can't break away from the aspect of maybe a love for the person and the love for children that come from this union, but it's divorced from what it ought to be. Still, you just bring that up.
Yeah, he definitely is. And we see here, I mean, the problem that we see in America today with the just the abundance of sexual problems that are going on in America today. But this one being actually quite a bit older than the kind of sodomite revolution that we're experiencing right now. Just this issue of cohabitation, right? I remember that whenever my parents would turn on TV when I was really young, one of the shows that was on at the time was Friends, and back in the 90s and 2000s, and just the proliferation of it was just commonly accepted as if this was just the normal way that we were to live, that normal people lived. Of course, you live with somebody before you marry them, and how would you know if you could marry them unless you live with them? But and the idea of sex to them had nothing to do with children. Children was was contrary to the end for which they did that. It was all pleasure. It was all each other's company that was really important. And children was maybe an afterthought, maybe something you'd want to do when you were in your 30s well, I mean, at some point that's can't really go much beyond that. So it's we're seeing the same kind of decadence in Augustine's life here, and recognizing that cohabitation and marriage are not the same thing.
Yeah, Friends seems like watching PBS Kids today. It's like, oh man, it's nothing. Will and Grace, Modern Family, whatever garbage is on TV. I don't even know the shows because I can't even watch them. Most of them, whatever came after that is even worse. That didn't fall out of the sky. It's
which is so
works.
It's so ironic that sex being a gift that God gives to mankind for reproduction, right? That we can the ultimate act of pleasure and love that we do physically is something that actually produces life, right? It is a life giving when done in the correct context, and yet are pushing ourselves down this rabbit hole of being so sex crazed in so many senses is making us the opposite, making us death giving. Right? People are barren. They're making themselves intentionally barren, and a whole host of other things because the thing that God gifted mankind to bring life, that life is no longer what is what is desired by those who engage in it. So, very sad state of the world we're seeing here, and an astute observation by Saint Augustine here.
As he says in the beginning, without you, what am I to myself but a guide to my own self-destruction? See more of that. And then even it goes on, when all is well with me, what am I but an infant sucking your milk and feeding on you? The food that is incorruptible, as that is in John 6. It's like, at best, I'm simply a babe dependent upon you. And at worst, I'm apart from you, seeking everything that leads to every road of perdition. And so he's just checking the boxes of things that continue to lead to self-destruction.
As we go toward the he reminds us here before we get into the main topic of this chapter, which is his friendship with someone who ends up dying, and it really crushes him. But he mentions that he's still in Manichaeanism. This is really going to be a problem for him going forward. But he's through it, and he explores some of the different aspects of practice here, and talks about this really weird one. So I wanted to ask y'all, we're Calvinists, right? And being Calvinist, we talk a lot about election. And
you're gonna out me like that publicly?
I mean, I assume that was pretty well known.
It's all over.
Will has been exposed.
It gets worse.
Right. Oh yes. But we talk about election, talk about the elect, those that God has elected before all of time, to dwell with Him forever, and to be His children. But the Manichees also talk about the elect. Do they mean the same thing by that term, Reverend Miller?
No.
No, they don't.
No, but explain, Reverend Maltby.
Okay, yes, I'm happy to. The elect for the Manichees were, so Manichaeanism, as we talked about last time, is this very Gnostic cult, and in this Gnostic cult, there were those who were kind of deemed to be the best of the best, those that were spiritually better than all else. But because they were so Gnostic, these elect would refuse to work. So work was an evil because it was physical, it was toil, it was something that indicated your marriage to the lesser, dirty physical reality. And so those that were kind of initiates, or those that were lesser but still in the cult, would go out and buy food and bring them to the elect for them to eat. And not to make it too crude, but because it was believed that the elect, by their spiritual Gnostic understanding of the real world, the spiritual world, that by them ingesting and digesting and getting rid of all of that food, that they were actually making the world a better place just by doing that. And so the initiates, like Augustine, which we see here in the first few chapters, felt that they were actually doing good for the world by bringing food from the evil world to be digested and expelled by the elect. And that was actually like this spiritually blessed thing. And so he becomes obsessed with doing this as he is taking on this teaching job in his hometown.
It's interesting that he calls, in speaking about the food being given to them, He calls
Mhm.
their stomachs the laboratory of the stomach.
Mm.
That's where all the mixing and the all the magic happens. Right?
That's right.
Yeah.
It's this very bizarre thing, but it just goes to show uh, how far he had fallen, um, even in his what he thought was pursuit of truth. Because he's looking back at this and he's not saying this to his own credit that he fell for this kind of practice.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. He was very concerned with. Uh, excuse me, I thought I'd sneeze. He was very concerned with demons, right? And so he's like, I don't want to
yes.
sacrifice to demons, yet by adherence to that superstition, I sacrificed myself to them.
Hmm.
Right. So he
Yeah,
is
I read that
all.
line. That was a scary line.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I mean, you think about all of these practices by Gnostics and by um, heathen and unbelievers. I mean, they are all quite demonic, right? It's like like James teaches us: you either have wisdom from above or you have wisdom that is demonic. I mean,
Hmm.
it really is the work and fruit of the work of the devil in the hearts of sinful men that looks and is very grotesque and just dark and very concerning to us as believers. It really twists our stomachs, not in the same way that Augustine was talking about, but twists our stomachs and causes us to be repulsed by such things.
Hmm.
To see somebody engaging in demonic activity willfully, um, you know, playing around with the demons is a deadly thing.
It is indeed, yeah, and all of these pagan practices ultimately point back to that, and there's
Yeah.
a level in which we must be careful. We just know from I guess from horror films and things like that that like just that we know what it is that all that leads to. It becomes more grotesque. It becomes more dark and more uh, things that we wouldn't. We can look at somebody in some of those films, some of those like cultic kind of practices, and we think, why would I ever do this kind of thing? But we see Augustine, a very bright young man who's gone to college and had like Will said, is probably at the equivalent of a graduate or postgraduate degree right now, and yet is still falling for these things. And I think are in modern times as we as a society drift further and further away from our Christian moorings, we we see the same kind of things, and uh, it's not just foolish girls on TikTok drawn to witchcraft and wizardry. It is people in the upper echelons of society that are promoting this kind of stuff now. People with
Mhm.
the highest level of education.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, you see the fruit of self deception, and then the
mhm,
willingness of the self deceived to deceive others. I mean, he
mhm.
said that specifically in the early part of this book, right? To say, yeah, I was deceived and I deceived others.
Yeah. You can
Mhm.
never get away from God's law, right? It's like you can't get away from priests, you can't get away from sacrifices, you can't get away from ordinances. And the Manichees, they didn't believe in animal sacrifices. They actually they kind of did the Andy Stanley, like, but not for the same reasons. But they actually abhorred the Old Testament at large. Um, and they didn't believe in the animal sacrifices in the Old Testament. Thought it was horrendous and wrong. But the irony is that you still have these food sacrifices. You still have the priestly ordinances. You still have the priests who are basically sacrificing before the elect in these purity rituals, right?
Mhm.
And so you never get away from these things, even when you hate them. You just take and you corrupt, and you try to create man these, um, these humanist centric concepts of taking that which God has prescribed and saying, well, that's all wrong, but I'm going to do it my way.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So when it's always put your tinfoil caps on, or not, not even necessarily those, but you say, well, it's not, it's actually it's the opposite. It's not even putting a cap on. It's saying, well, the humanists, the pagans, they disregard these things, but where are their priests? Where are their sacrifices? Where is their atonement? Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you can find them in any religion, whether even if secular humanism and atheism, you see
Mm-hmm.
the things that are, you still see the priests. And that's kind of what I think a lot. Where are the priests in the Manichaeism? This is kind of an aspect of where you see it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's as Tolkien said, evil cannot create; it can merely corrupt and pervert that which has already been created.
Can only sing a song of discord along with
That's
Eru.
right. That's right. A page for reading the Silmarillion. If you haven't read the Silmarillion, highly recommend it. But this idea that, yeah, that we need atonement. Everyone knows they need atonement, and how they do that is really the question, not whether they do that. And so we're seeing that here, right? I mean, in some foolish and perverted way, Augustine thinks he's atoning for things. He's putting more good into the world for any bad that he may have put into the world by offering food that he bought at the marketplace to the elect so that they can purge it of its wickedness in the laboratory of the stomach and expel blessedness into the world, spiritualness.
Yeah. It's this, he said it's a, there was a desire to be set free, right? That was kind of the goal, and in many ways, and yet it's such a deceived, blind view of true freedom, right? It's grasping at the wind and always receiving the same result over and over again, which is you realize that you're still in bondage, and you're in bondage to evil and the depravity of the mind, and the true freedom that is only found in Christ is far from you, right? Or far from them and the rest of the Manichees. But
yeah. So what's all this nonsense about the stars that I'm reading about?
Stars. Well, you have to wake up and go get the newspaper, right? So you can figure out your horoscope, so you can know what to do for the day, and that's that's well, of course, yeah. Let's talk about astrology, right? The idea that the stars have influence upon our lives, and not merely in a naturalistic sort of way, right? You can read lots of scientists or people that talk about that. Yeah, there's the natural world does have an effect on our lives at times, but there's a very spiritual idea here that somehow being born under a particular star or a star being in a certain place at a certain time influences you, not maybe making you feel one way or the other, but to such an extent that you can be held blameless for certain actions that you took. And so this became a kind of side hobby of Augustine for a little while.
Why do you think that he called them, his consultation with the astrologers, he called them imposters? Why did he view them as imposters?
I think he began to understand that this was a lot of tomfoolery, and he even says that it wasn't, like, even looking back, that it wasn't long before he realized what all this was. A lot of this was charlatanism, and so he kind of saw that, but he still had this desire to want to consult with them because it made him feel like he was gaining wisdom. It made him feel like he was, it gave him an excuse. He actually identifies the thing that he really was after, which was an excuse for sinful behavior. To say, hey, it was, I guess, Mars rose too high today, and so I was. I'm sorry, I was a little belligerent, and that's kind of what he was getting at. But he realized a lot of these men, like so many of the philosophers in the empire at this time, were just after money and influence.
Seems like things don't change over time. The astrologers of our day do the same thing.
It's true.
Yeah.
I love he has a man who he respects come in and kind of shake him up. Not even a Christian man, as far as I can tell. That he doesn't point to him being Christian whatsoever. But a man who basically studied this to such a degree that he sought to seek his living by doing this. And he describes him as a kind and fatherly man who he was speaking to. He said that from my remarks, he discovered that I was addicted to the books of those who cast horoscopes. In a kind and fatherly way, he advised me to throw them away and not to waste on the nonsense the care and labor required for useful matters. So he's saying the opportunity cost, you're wasting your time on foolish things and they can be better spent to good things. He called them astrology to be utterly bogus. And he said that he, being a serious-minded person, did not wish to make a living out of deceiving people, right? And then Augustine basically says, well, okay, but Augustine this is kind of his side hobby at the time. This wasn't his main endeavor, but he was reading all of these books. He's like, well, how come these things happen sometimes? These there seems to be something to this. And the man at this point basically just points to, I asked him why many of the forecasts turned out to be correct. He replied that the best answer he could give was the power apparent in lots, right? And basically by chance, and we see this all the time with whether it's the horoscope all the way to the Indian palm readers to the hyper-charismatic who want to prophesy over you. They all kind of do the same thing, not to throw Christian brothers too much under the bus, but it does need to be addressed. It's wrong and it's evil. Even the prophecies that have been said over me, the last time I was ever prophesied over, and it's happened like 2 or 3 times in my life, some of it was, I just want to let you know that God is going to use you for, great things. Okay. I already know the covenant blessings of God. So, it goes back to if you're saying something that the scriptures agree with, obviously, to that famous quote, and, the prophecy is unnecessary. If it disagrees, then it is false prophecy. So truly, either way, false. Or the last time I had just finished, back when I used to do kind of worship leading with the guitar and the skinny jeans and all that fun stuff. Don't hold it against me. I had finished one Lord's Day, and someone walked in and was like, hey, just so you know, I just feel like God wants you to know. He told me that he's going to use you as a worship leader. I was like, I literally just did that. So sometimes we use the lots to our advantage, and we use chance to our advantage for, or we keep it so vague. But we see this in astrology all the time. Your horoscope says today you will meet an interesting person. It's like, well, I didn't. Oh, but I was on Twitter earlier, and I had an interesting conversation with somebody. That must have been it, right? But sometimes it becomes, lots by that, or maybe it's more specific and it just happens to come true. So this guy isn't even really taking the hot Christian take on this, but even the pagan or the secular, it seems, is, hey, this is just divination of chance and lots, and don't waste your time on, quote, utterly bogus things.
Right. And how much of those is it, do we even just kind of make into truths that happen in our lives just because it's so vague and hard to pin down, and like something so vague and easy to make occur, like, oh, you're going to meet someone interesting today. Well, now my mind is already thinking about that, and then I start talking to someone and I'm like, oh, well, I guess that person is interesting, right? And so it's the power of a lot of these kind of charlatan type prophecies, I think, is just in you kind of fixate an idea in somebody's mind that's vague enough that it could really happen to anyone. and then they are thinking about that, and then they cause it to occur just through their own actions throughout the day. So it's very easy to do that, and so it's luckily the Lord even used perhaps someone that wasn't a Christian to kind of pull Augustine away from such foolishness. And of course, this is at this level, right? We're still talking just about foolishness. There, of course, is other kinds of, as we've already talked about, there are darker sides to some of these things that are far more deadly. But here he was just kind of obsessed with the charlatan side of it.
Yeah. You never see the, hey, on August 24th, a tornado will come and destroy your house. But, this important item will be preserved. Something so specific, And then sometimes people want to get so specific, or you have during COVID, you had people like Kenneth Copeland saying, on this day, COVID, you will be gone. And they actually get a little bold. And they kind of, to their own demise, choose to be a little bit less vague. And then it's like, oh, that month, more people died from COVID than any other month. The curses of God are upon you. So
yeah, it's
stick to being vague if you want to be an imposter.
True.
So you'll out yourself.
Well, as we'll kind of move here to the main event of this chapter, which is his friend, because he's back at his hometown, right? We're in Tagaste, a small town. I say few hours. I'm thinking, of course, as the car drives, so a little bit further probably as far as walking is concerned, south of Carthage. And he's got this friend that he knows that is involved, like probably an old family friend is the way he kind of describes him. He doesn't give us a name, but somebody that especially went to church with him, that would have known Monica, that would have been raised probably in a very similar situation to Augustine, and he becomes close friends with him and tries really to get him to buy into Manichaeanism. I think we're seeing Augustine at his cage stage of Manichaeanism right now. This is a new thing that he's bought hook, line, and sinker, and he really just wants to preach the truths of the prophet Mani to everybody around him. And so this close friend he has, he really tries to take under his wing. And at first, how is that received by his friend, Pastor Miller?
Well, he says at one point here, right, that the friendship was sweet. It had been ripened by good zeal and common study, but he said he had turned him away from the true faith, which he wasn't sound in. He hadn't mastered it as a youth, and he turned him to the superstitious and harmful fables, which my mother mourned in me. Right? So he wooed him over to agree with some of the Manichaean doctrine, and and that was tragic. And he goes on to say, it's interesting with me, this man went wandering off in error, and my soul could not exist without him. So yeah, there was some tragedy in that relationship from a spiritual perspective, and that his friend wandered from the truth.
Yeah.
It goes to show us really how dangerous when error creeps into us, how dangerous we can be toward others.
It really speaks to the importance of solid friendships.
True.
Because we become so connected. I mean, he was a childhood buddy of his, and he grew up with him. They already had this long-term intimate connection as friends and grew up together, and so they clicked and everything was fantastic. But all the more reason why then um, Augustine was able to get get behind this friend's defenses
Right.
in ways that other people, it would take much longer to do for sure, if they were able to do so at all. But as this close friend could quite easily and quite quickly say, hey, friend, I hold to these things dearly. So should you. Let me tell you about
Mm-hmm.
Right. So that obviously the whole point that we've brought up is his friend is going to die from a
them.
sickness. Praise God, his friend. So they kind of sneaky baptize him.
That's right.
Which, say what you will, it had an effect on him.
That's true. It did.
God, he still, to some degree, there was a means of grace, and God did, whether rightly or wrongly administered, don't need to get in the weeds now, but his friend does turn to God in his last days. Because he's baptized, and then Augustine, this is a grand joke. Hey, let's joke around about this. You were baptized while you're on your sick bed, basically while you're passed out. How funny is that? And then his friend demonstrates kind of a change of heart, where he says that he was horrified at me as if I were an enemy. Which this is a big switch. And with amazing and immediate frankness, advised me, if I wish to be his friend, I must stop saying this kind of thing to him. Right.
I think we're seeing a regeneration by the Holy Spirit in this man's life, that he would switch on a dime and now desires the things of God so zealously that just hearing the things of God being joked about is repulsive to his soul, and he can't stand it even in his best friend.
Yeah. Which is a way that it was encouraging to me to speak to our friends who are non-believers in a way that I strive to, which is, hey, we can be friends, but if you're going to, for instance, take the Lord's name in vain, you best not be doing that around me, or we're not going to be able to maintain our close friendship, because I'm not going to be around this sort of thing, right? And I really was encouraged by his zeal to speak to his bosom friend here in such a way, and to see his faith and zeal for the Lord, right? Because he obviously saw his baptism as true, and he valued it very highly in his apparent regeneration from what Augustine is talking about here. And he seemed like he was getting better, and then a few days later, when Augustine was gone, he died. And now we enter into kind of the biggest theme of this book, which is about putting your hope in these worldly things. And I don't say worldly as in a bad way. The scriptures speak about worldly things in many different ways. And it's important. Sometimes when it says of this world, or worldly, or flesh, and sometimes that's used in a negative context. And it's not always, right? So we're going to talk about worldly things, I think, now. And we're not going to call our friendships here that exist in the world that God made as bodily, where your spirit indwelt bodies, right? That's what we are as humans. So we're not talking about worldly things as necessarily wrong, and we're not to love the world in a certain sense, but we do love God's world, and we love what he's created. We're supposed to love our neighbor. That's part of the world. We're supposed to honor our father and mother. They exist within the world. There is virtue to loving your people, your country, to taking care. There are proverbs talk about taking care of your animals. You want to talk about things that don't have souls, right?
Right.
So when I say worldly, I'm not saying that negatively, but
earthly might be a better
earthly
term.
earthly things, yeah. But but these earthly things and putting too much hope in them. And when they get taken away, where does that leave us? Right. I always think of I mentioned this a few weeks ago in one of our trainings I had with Pastor Miller. It's my favorite quote from Lonesome Dove, which took me a year to read. So only read it if you really want to. But in the beginning, when you have Gus and he says to Lori, because she wants to go off to California and she wants it so bad, she wants to do whatever it takes and hook up with a guy who she shouldn't hook up with, and she's just obsessed. And he's like, Laura, darling, if you want anything bad enough, it's sure to disappoint you. Because as soon as you either don't get that thing or you have it and then it's taken away, you go into complete despair. Right. And she basically is, the rest of the book is just depressing because she's depressed the entire time. She loses her desire. She doesn't get to California. She ends up falling in love with Gus and then he dies. Sorry.
Spoiler.
The book's been around for a long time. It's your fault if whatever. It's like saying Darth Vader's Luke's father. Spoiler. Sorry. You had time. But she loses everything and she's just depressed the whole rest of the book. Like wants to take her own life, all sorts of things. But we see putting too much. Where should we be putting our hope? And I think you see that through. He's going to demonstrate the what does he quote? Does he quote Lamentations somewhere?
Right after the, yeah,
I think. Oh yeah, the grief that darkened his heart, and you see the shadow fall over him, kind of for the rest of the chapter.
Yeah, I think here we're seeing friendship, though it is a friendship being a very good thing, and like Pastor Miller already talked about, that the importance of good friendship and the importance of our brothers in Christ, right? And we know the Proverbs speak to this. A friend is born for adversity, and a brother loves at all times. These are good things that we ought to pursue, and yet here in this low point, this love that he had, this brotherly love that he had for this friend of his, became an obsession and became something that was not tempered at all with a love of God, right? This is a time in his life when he has no love for God. And so we see it pull him away and pull him down into despair. And he begins this kind of long contemplative monologue of the loves that are in our hearts and the way that they're complex and they pull us in this direction and that direction. And not your normal TED talk from today that always talks about love conquering all and love being follow your heart and all of the modern truisms that are not true at all. He rarely recognizes how deadly all of these loves that were dancing around in his heart and pulling him in all these directions were really what they were really doing to him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Go ahead, brother.
I was going to quote us. He says that, I suppose that the more I loved him, the more hatred and fear I felt for the death which had taken him from me. Right. Mm-hmm. This idea of, as he loved this thing, placing his loves, what would be the word? Disordered loves. Mm-hmm. This disordering of your loves actually breeds a fear and a hatred if you love something too much. Right. Mm-hmm. You can love your wife too much in a disordered way. Not truly love them, because true love is actually a love that is not separate from the peace and the knowledge and the love for God, right? If your loves are ordered, then you don't fall into this pit. But when you start to place things on a pedestal which they don't belong, the fear of losing them puts you in a state of fear and hatred for the thought of death. You cannot cope with it. Talks about what madness, and he does seem to be in a place of almost madness, a mad grief, not to understand how to love human beings with awareness of the human condition. Pastor, what were you going to say?
Yeah, that was actually a great segue into what I was wanting to point out, that he speaks of he speaks of his fretting, his sighing, his weeping, his tormenting himself, right? He took no rest or counsel from others, dragging himself around, and his torn and bloody soul. He was impatient, dragging it around. He couldn't find a place to lay it down. Like we said at the beginning of the podcast, there's a real restlessness and an inability to find rest, right? But just found in a cycle of ongoing self-torment, and it really spiraling, maybe even more so than being a cycle, just spiraling himself, down into the ground. It's important to see how, unbelievers and believers do grieve differently. Although one could say, well, with some believers, even, especially in the early phases of grief, it looks pretty similar for some.
Right.
But, we ought to grieve, and by the Spirit's help and work, we ought to grieve as those who have hope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. He talks about the transient things. He says, "Let the transient things be on the ground on which my soul praises you." Right? We're not disregarding the transient things. Wine gladdens the heart, and wine comes and goes ever so quickly. He says that, but in these things there is no point of rest. Reference back to the very first page of book 1. They lack permanence. They flee away and cannot be followed with bodily senses. No one can fully grasp them, even while they are present. It's like not even just when they go away. I like that. Even while they're present, without an ordered loves. He's like, one, these transient things, by the definition of transience, they pass away. But with this disordered love, even while you have them, right, you cannot fully grasp them. In a sense, enjoy the things that God has given you for the time that you have them, if you don't have the correct order in your loves.
Yeah, I think this is really segues into very nicely into the kind of the main question that I really came away with from this chapter, which was, if there are all these good things that we have, right, like a friend, like a wife, like children, like even physical things, right? And we're talking about like a glass of wine or a nice dinner or things that seem simple. These things, when their love becomes so unordered, they take us away from God. And you bringing there that quote from him saying you can't grasp them even while they're there in a moment, right? When they're present, they're with you. It speaks to this kind of irony of how disordered our naturally sinful hearts are, that the things that are right in front of us, they should be in our kind of sinful, simple minds as humans. We would think that those should be the things that are easiest to grasp. And yet, the things that are most permanent, the things that we can really, truly grasp onto that really actually transform us, well, the thing is Christ himself, is the Lord God Almighty, who, though we in our sinful hearts and sinful eyes do not see him right before, is actually far nearer to us than any of all these things that steal our hearts away. And so the friendship there can burn far, far more fiercely, the friendship that God offers through his incarnate Son, than the friendship that Augustine felt very deeply for this friend that he had. So it kind of goes to show us that these things can become inordinate. But let me throw this question, and we kind of start to wrap up here. We're on the 5 o'clock mark here. I know there's more to the chapter and other things that could be said, but we're trying to be respectful of everyone's time here. But if inordinate loves like this can take us away from love of God, even an inordinate love of of a brother like this, or inordinate love of a spouse or a child, or anything that's earthly, does that mean that we should not have love for these things? Should we pursue a life where we get rid of any attachment to all of these types of things?
I
I'll
think
start
the
with
clear
Will.
answer.
Oh.
Go ahead.
No, you go first.
Well, I think the clear answer is no, right? We disordered love that leads to sin, that leads to obsession, that then leads to idolatrous worship of the gift instead of the giver, um, is, puts things upside down. And so it's God who defines the value of the gift that he gives, and these are gifts.
Mhm.
And so therefore, because he's given them, they have value, and he has declared them to be good. And we need to be good stewards of such things. We need to be use them rightly and appropriately. But because one can become sinfully obsessed and not treat it as it ought, and then incur and feel the consequences of that, is about the sinner, not about the gift.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
This made me think of some people will judge me for quoting, but I don't care. It's very good. I was thinking of, I just had to look it up, in Aquinas' Summa
Mhm.
on question 26. He talks about the order of charity, which when he's talking about charity, he's really talking about love. It's
Right.
kind of the way that he uses that word.
Coming from the Latin word caritas, which we translate love.
Exactly. And in Article 2 of question 26, he asks about whether God ought to be loved more than our neighbor. So we're getting to this order. And he'll talk about love God more than your wife. Should you love your son more than your wife? Should you love your son more than your daughter? Should you love your wife more than your all these sorts of things? Some of those answers I actually don't agree with, but largely he's right. In Article 2, he talks about whether God ought to be loved more than our neighbor. And one of his objections, he says, well, it would seem that we ought to love, God ought not to be loved more than our neighbor, because in 1 John 4:20, he that loveth not his brother whom he seeth cannot, how can he love God who he hasn't seeneth? So he's getting this, he's setting up this kind of this logical if this then this, right? This supposition. Well, then we should love our neighbor first, because we love our neighbor, then we'll love God. But he kind of answers how each kind of friendship regards chiefly the subject in which we chiefly find the good and the fellowship. So basically, in total, he largely responds, therefore, God ought to be loved chiefly, because out of all of charity, for he is loved as the cause of happiness, whereas our neighbor is loved as receiving together with us a share of happiness from him. He has a lot more to say than that. But it gets back to this concept of the ordering of your loves. Those are all good things to love. It's good to love your dog to a degree, right? But where does that fall? We know that Christians understand this concept, that you're not going to love your children well if you don't love your wife well. And you should love your life primarily, chiefly, firstly. Otherwise, you're actually neglecting the love for your children. If I don't put, and even the most basic Christians understand, I hear it all the times, like when they're trying to find someone for their daughter, they're like, I want to find someone who loves Jesus more than my daughter. That's pretty basic, normative. Christians understand that, because they understand if you don't love Christ first, you're not going to love my daughter well. But you see this in all things, right? If God is not chiefly desired out of all charity, then we don't have true charity for any other thing, all of which is subordinate to him. For he causes the chief happiness of all things, and everything else together is just shared in the endeavor of the happiness and joy that comes from God in the first place, right? So as I think the theme of this chapter is, we're not saying not to love earthly things. There are things in this earth to love, and there are things in this earth to hate, right? Hate is not the opposite of love. In order to love something well, you must hate something equally. If you love chasteness, you hate rape, right? those things flow from each other. So it's good to love and hate certain things, but you're not going to love and hate correctly if you not get your ducks in a row and God doesn't come first. And here, to bring back to Augustine, he has not yet discovered a love for God.
Mhm.
So by this, everything else has become vanity. And he doesn't get it yet. He confesses it as he kind of steps out from his biography, from his confessions of sin into his confessions towards God's holiness, looking back and saying, woe to this poor boy. Or as I said before, it reminds me all the time of Dickens, when Scrooge is looking at himself. He's like, oh, this poor boy. Looking back on him, he's looking at the ghost of Christmas past. I know I mentioned that, I think, the last episode. It's really what he's doing, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it was a great passage you read there, and it talking about how God being the chief source of all love. It should be the chief. He should be the chief of our affections in every way. And once we are ordered in that way, then we can actually rightly love. And I, when reading that passage from Augustine about his friend and the death of his friend, it took me back to many funerals that I've been to. I think we can all think of people in our lives that have reposed and have gone to be with the Lord, and we can perhaps even think of funerals where we're not so certain that the person in that casket has gone on to be with the Lord. And there's a difference. If you've been to a Christian funeral and have you been to a not Christian funeral, there is a world of difference. And the love that Augustine could have had for his friend, had they both been in Christ and had they both set their affections chiefly on Christ, would have actually been fiercer, would have actually been greater than the love he had then. And so, yes, in a sense, it perhaps would have hurt more when his friend left, but tempered by a hope that this is not the end. A funeral done well will express not merely the mourning. There is time for mourning. There's a time to mourn. But it also speaks of the mourning without the you that comes when the sun breaks through, when we go to be with our loved ones because we are going to be with Christ, when the resurrection actually occurs and we are all in our physical bodies united around the throne on the hill in the New Zion. Because the Christian always has hope. We have faith, we have hope, we have love. And so, yeah, this is, I think, a beautiful counterexample that Augustine is giving us, that because his loves were not rightly ordered here, it led to just misery. And actually, had he loved Christ, he would have loved his friend more. But then this death would not have crushed him in the way that it did.
Yeah. All things exist to bring pleasure to God, right? We see this in Genesis, that God called them good. He delighted in his creation. He says in section 18, if physical objects give you pleasure, praise God for them. In return, love to their master, lest in the things that please you, you displease him. That is God, right? So if God is giving good gifts, take pleasure in them, but be warned lest the gift supersedes in your own love, your love, the gift rather than the giver, so that you start to worship the creation over the creator, right? So it's a warning on both sides. We become ascetic, where you want to become monastic to a lesser degree, and you start to divorce yourself, you start to retreat, which I would argue we see more of that in the theological West, more of the asceticism, more of the antinomianism than we do the blatant hedonism. Obviously, in the culture, we see that they're loving the creature and worshiping the creature over the creator. But there's such a fear in that to the Christian today, and you've seen it all the way back to, I mean, you even see Augustine wanting to become a little bit monastic at times. We'll see that after he gets out of Manichaeism, which that's the other ditch. You begin to fear the things of this world because I don't want my loves become disordered. One, I don't want to love these things, or two, I don't want to be tempted by these things, the evil things or the good things. But a right Christian view say God has given me these things, like we've already quoted. God has given wine to make glad the hearts of man. Right? It really is an affront to God to say, no, I despise the good gifts you've given me because they can be abused. So I fall into the ditch of asceticism, often out of fear. I don't want those things. I do not want to rejoice in the gifts of God. I don't want to have any, a response here is like, well, no more friends. Friends die. So therefore, I'm just never going to have friends again. You have a wife who passes away and think, I'll never remarry, even though perhaps my children need a new mother, right? And it's good for me to have a wife, and there's maybe a prospect because I can't bear the thought of a loss. Or whether it's fear of rejecting something good, or even just the fear of things that can be twisted, or abused, like alcohol. But so it's the warning on either side of the ditch, right? Where we do not want to become ascetic and reject the world that we live in. Because God has given us this world as vice regents to steward, to care for, and this is the world that he set his kingdom into. Right? To reject it would be foolish and actually completely against the commission that he's given us as his faithful followers and as his church. Say, no, I want nothing to do with this world. But Christ is saying, this is the very same world that I am to make new. This world will not be annihilated, right? I'm not going to annihilate this world and give you something different because the world's so terrible. No, I will redeem. I'll bring us back to the garden, right? I will restore the paradise that was lost. And so we should be seeking to redeem all things, enjoy them properly. And that ultimately, of course, can't do any of that if we don't, I'm starting to repeat myself now, so I'll stop it. We can't do that without honoring first the great giver before the gift. But it does not annex the gift.
Right. In fact, it enhances it. Indeed. Well, wise words, Will. So I think those are good wise words to end on. So join us next time. We're going to be jumping into book number 5, and we're continuing along our journey. Only a few more chapters until we get to the part where he actually gets converted. I believe that's book 8. So just 3 more to go. But yes, join us next time. And until then, we will be signing off. The Lord bless you, and we will see y'all next time.